Hello and welcome to the new season of Design Emergency. I'm Alice Rawsthorn, co-founder of Design Emergency with Paolo Antonelli, and we're delighted that our first guest for the new season will be the Chicago-based social designer and educator, Maya Bird Murphy, who will discuss her pioneering work in empowering young people to engage with design and architecture while advocating for social, economic, gender and racial diversity in the architecture and design professions. Maya began in 2017 at the age of 25 when she was completing a master's degree in architecture while working full-time. She founded Mobile Makers as a non-profit and kitted out an old US mail truck as a mobile classroom and tool shop, which she drove around disinvested areas of Chicago to run workshops, summer camps, and other projects in schools, youth centers, museums, and community spaces. Mobile Makers has won many awards and now has a bricks and mortar base in Humboldt Park, Chicago, and it's extended its work into Boston and Aspen. And Maya is developing a new project, Alternative Practice, to document the work of designers and design teams who are experimenting with new approaches to design. So Maya, could you begin by describing how you discovered design and why you decided to focus on developing and delivering new approaches to design education through Mobile Makers?
Well, I have a kind of interesting origin story because I grew up in Oak Park, Illinois, and that is a place that is home to tons of Frank Lloyd Wright buildings. And so I was kind of immediately launched into the world of architecture, and my community was always talking about it. We just could casually take a stroll and go past a lot of different works of architecture. And so I really had this upbringing where I had the privilege of experiencing architecture right outside my door.
Well, lucky you, and you live in Oak Park now, don't
I
you?
do. I just moved back recently.
So why did you decide to move away from sort of pure or standard architecture and focus on youth empowerment?
I think that leaving Oak Park for college was a big shift in my thinking about architecture. I grew up in this place. I mean, downtown Chicago is known for its architecture, and I just had easy access to it. And so leaving this area was really kind of a culture shock for me. Going to Indiana, to a Rust Belt town, and seeing the lack of development happening. And I realized that that is likely most of our country and a lot of places in the world where architecture is not at the forefront of your mind. And so I started to think about, if you have not experienced architecture as a child, or if you don't experience it as an adult, how would you ever think that that is a career that is open or accessible to you? And so I began understanding that architecture was not diverse, and that I would be one of the few people of color in school and in work. And so I decided to start thinking through what it would be like if this field was open to everyone and if everyone was allowed to engage in architectural discourse.
So why did you decide to launch Mobile Makers? Why was that specific concept your solution to this?
Once I came back to Chicago, I started working traditionally in the architecture field, and I realized that we were not really talking about social issues. I realized that firms were really trying to stay apolitical, and I thought that architecture could engage in so many of the pressing issues that we are seeing around us. And so I went back to get my Master of Architecture, and through that process I did a thesis which became Mobile Makers. And so all of my thoughts and experiences from being in this field that was not very inclusive all kind of came together to become this nonprofit. And so Mobile Makers is an organization that offers youth workshops and community engagement, creates public installations, and hosts pop-ups all over the city out of a retrofitted mail truck.
Given that a lot of architects and designers who are listening to this are probably interested in addressing similar challenges to you. Could you give us an idea about the scale and impact of mobile makers? For example, how many people have participated in your program so far? How many people are working, whether it's on a paid or voluntary basis for you? And are your annual costs and how do you fund them?
Mobile Makers has been around for about 8 years now. And in the past few years, we've reached about 1,000 young people per year. And so the way that we do that is through year-round after-school programs, summer programming, field trips, pop-ups, visits to schools. And this all started with just me in 2017, but over the years it has grown to up to 10 people at times. And so we kind of fluctuate between there. In 2018, when we were starting, our revenue was about $10,000. And then only 5 years later, it was about $450,000. And so we have grown immensely and do many different types of programming. And to keep the business thriving, I've been really intentional about having multiple streams of income. And so we're funded by grants and donations, but also program service fees. And we've been doing a lot more consulting, and we've been getting some commissions for public art and community engagement projects.
And what lessons have you learnt during the 8 years of running Mobile Makers in terms of the pros and cons of running a nonprofit?
Honestly, I think that I've mostly learned that there is always something to learn and that I do not know everything and that running a business is not easy. And I started Mobile Makers with just architecture education. And so I had basically no business knowledge. And so I had to learn a lot on the fly. And I think, because I was 25, I was also a little bit naive about what it would take to actually keep a business afloat. And so it's just a constant learning process, and I'm still learning. And I think that when I was starting, I was really looking for perfection, and I was working constantly so that I could reach that perfection. And so I think I've also learned to, through a lot of things going wrong and through failure, I think I've adjusted my goals and standards to be more realistic and to create boundaries and to prioritize rest. But I think I've also really learned to be diligent and disciplined and trust myself in my decisions, but then also really trust others to kind of help Mobile Makers evolve into what it will be in the future.
And so, having talked about the scary parts of running a nonprofit and how you've risen to the challenge of addressing them, can you give us a couple of examples of what you feel are Mobile Makers' key achievements in terms of its impact on individuals and communities?
For me, success looks like, one child feeling seen and creating something that they're proud of during a workshop, all the way to Mobile Makers having an effect on the actual built environment through that public art or community engagement. And so a specific example of that is a community center project that we worked on where we led the community engagement effort. And so this was a real project happening in Chicago in a disinvested community. And we actually had the great privilege of being a part of the building of this new building that would be for the community, and knowing that we helped community members and youth have an actual say in what that building would be like, because they would be the ones using it. And so I think it's really exciting to think about the longer impact that Mobile Makers will have, because we're having impact at a lot of different scales.
And having successfully launched Mobile Makers from the mail truck, which I've always been very jealous of because it just looks fantastic to see all the photos of you driving around in it, you now operate from a physical base in Chicago, which I had the pleasure of visiting recently, and it's an amazing resource. How is it enabling you to develop your work, and what lessons have you learned from the process of constructing it, fundraising for it, and expanding the organization to use it.
Having the permanent space is absolutely game changing. The truck is also amazing, but it really doesn't allow for that deep engagement with the students and with different topics. And so the permanent space is really about community building and for young people to feel like they have a safe third space to just hang out in and be their authentic selves. It also means that we can host our own events and invite larger community into the space to just share time with each other, which I think is really important these days. The difficult thing about a permanent space is, of course, the rent. And it really changes the pressure you feel to keep it going and to keep the organization going. And so that's the biggest lesson that I think I learned, was that it really changes how funding works for the organization. It really changes how much funding you need to be, bringing in on a month-to-month basis to just keep the space running. And I think the construction process was really amazing to see. I am an architectural designer. I haven't gotten my license yet in the US, and so I don't get to see built work as often. And so I love to create these opportunities to build things in the world when I can. And so that was really the truck and the space have been these projects that I feel like I was able to use my architecture background for. And it's really amazing to see how the spaces are kind of taken over by the kids because it's really for them. And so it's amazing to see youth and communities engaging with the spaces that we're creating so that they can feel comfortable to create.
They must be really excited when they go there. It is an extraordinary place. I mean, another big change for mobile makers was that there are now projects in Boston and Aspen. So could you talk to us about what those projects consist of and how they relate to your other activities?
I think it's really incredible to do projects in other places. When I started Mobile Makers, I really was thinking that this was just for Chicago because I knew that it had to be a hyper-local approach. But what I realized, I think after the pandemic, I feel like I started to see more projects happening in other states, in other countries, and I felt more connected to folks outside of Chicago. And I realized that this approach can really work anywhere. And what's really important is that it's shaped by the place and by the people who live there. And so the project that we did in Boston, it's actually in New Bedford, which is right outside of Boston, is called the Changemakers Club. And this group of middle school girls designed their dream third space, and we helped facilitate that design to be fabricated and installed in their community. And similarly in Aspen, we worked with a group of young people who lived right outside of Aspen to transform an entire gallery in the Aspen Art Museum for the Youth Art Expo. And so even when we are doing work outside of Chicago, we are still doing the community engagement. We are still working with organizations on the ground to make each project of its place.
And another new project you're developing is alternative practice. So could you tell us about that, how it's evolving and what your long-term objectives are for it?
Alternative practice is, I would say, the first big project that I feel as excited about as Mobile Makers when I was starting that. This research is documenting and building accessible place-specific monographs of design practices pushing the traditional boundaries of architecture. And so the research team consists of me, and then Verda Alexander, Caleb Germanaro, and Megan Simmons. And we are essentially building, as the first phase, a website that makes it incredibly easy to find alternative practitioners who are working in the built environment a little bit differently. And so we're really trying to highlight the work that is being done across the US that is really directly solving some of our most pressing issues.
Could you give us a couple of examples of the kind of radical practices that will be involved?
These practices exist all over the country and are really working on their own local issues in a lot of different ways. And so what's really amazing is that we start to see the nuances of each practice and how they are problem solving to really address whatever's happening, in their region or in their city or in their neighborhood. We have interviewed about 30 practices so far. And to give an example, Duo, they're actually friends of mine, they just launched a project called Starling, which is a community building on an empty lot. And they actually fundraised with community members to make those community members part owners of that building. And so they not only transformed a lot that had sat empty for a very long time, but they built the building and then immediately gave it back to the community. There is a project in Berkeley, California called Girls Garage, and they are actually teaching girls how to use power tools, but then they have moved into this work of actually renovating homes in different parts of the Bay Area to help older folks or folks that can't afford renovations to make small renovations in their homes.
And so presumably the idea is that you'll enable the different practices to engage with one another so they feel less isolated and can call on other architects and designers who have similar missions and underlying principles and goals to them to work with them or offer advice, but also make it easier for people like me to identify their work. Is that correct?
I think the resource sharing is a really huge part of this because we're all working so hard on our individual projects and we're not speaking to each other. And so knowing each other and networking with each other is going to be incredibly important, especially as climate change starts to make larger impacts on our societies and as equity becomes something that feels much harder to achieve.
If you look back on the history of architecture and design, there have always been radicals and mavericks and activists who've worked on the margins to develop new forms of practice, specifically in engaging with acute social problems, environmental issues, and so on. But in recent years, it seems to me that there has been an explosion of interest in all these fields, which has been incredibly positive. It's really re-energized architecture and design politically, culturally, and so on. Why do you think this has happened? Why has there suddenly been all this interest in these once marginal areas of design?
When I think back to when I was in school, no one was really talking about social issues or political issues and how they relate to architecture. And I thought that that was really crazy because architecture is political, and when you're dealing with people, there's no way to separate architecture from society. And that's why I started to grow really frustrated with what we were doing in school and what we were doing at our work because it didn't actually engage with people, even though we're supposed to be the guards of like health, safety, welfare of people. And so I think it feels like young people are not drinking the Kool-Aid anymore. And I don't know exactly why that shift happened, but I think that at least when I was in school, I felt that I had all of these skills that were not being used, that could be used for all of the pressing issues that we see around us. And I think that as I go back and talk to students and engage with students, I think that we are just interested in doing good and seeing our work be impactful and actually having a workplace that we can do that in. And so I'm not sure when the shift happened or why it's happening, but I think that, climate change, we're seeing all of these things right in front of us that are changing, that are actually a threat to humanity. And so I think that young designers just want to have a part in addressing those issues.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And as ambitious, maverick young designers have proved again and again and again, they can address those issues with great efficiency, but also soul and compassion, which is so important. And your other big new project is, of course, the Design Summit for Friends of Friends, which is brilliantly named and will run from the 26th and 28th of September. This is the second edition of the summit. So, what is its role?
I think that as my practice expands, that I am looking for different types of programming that continues to make engaging in design more accessible. So the Design Summit for Friends of Friends is one of those ways where I felt that, kind of like with alternative practice, that folks weren't speaking to each other enough and connecting and sharing resources. This is really inviting a more interdisciplinary group of people together to talk about how we can leverage design to make positive change. And so we are inviting over 15 presenters to come together who are really coming at change making in very different ways. And we are hoping to speak about pressing issues and then also uplift some of these folks who are doing amazing work but may have not gotten the recognition that they deserve. The whole event will culminate with an outdoor block party. We will have house music, which is really important to Chicago and Chicago history. And that is really just so that we can all come together and just celebrate the hard work that each of us are doing in our little corners of the world and celebrate all of the gains, even if it feels like in political climates like this that, our hard work is not moving as far as we would like.
Despite the current political climate in the United States, you have achieved an incredible amount in the last 8 years, and you've also been a huge inspiration for other designers, architects, and design educators. So, what's next for Mobile Makers and your other projects? How do you envisage them developing in the future?
I feel like I'm at a really interesting point in my career. I am realizing that, as much as I love designing physical spaces, I really excel at creating these new systems that question and push against the status quo. I think that what excites me about mobile makers, and I think how I set it up, was really so that it's a container that can be really filled in many different ways. And I'm not really sure what mobile makers will look like in 5 years. And not that I don't have a vision or that I don't have a plan, but I do think that we have kept it open ended purposefully. And mobile makers doesn't look like what it looked like in year 2 now, and it won't look the same in 5 years. And I think I'm excited that mobile makers is being shaped by the people that engage with it, the people who are team members who are working on the projects. I think it's being shaped by what's happening in our community. And so I'm very excited to see how our impact changes and shifts in the future and evolves. I think that I'm in a place where I can finally start to think about other projects other than mobile makers. And that has been difficult in the past because I've just been so busy and just been so in it that I didn't have time to think about anything else. And so I'm really excited to work on things like alternative practice and the Design Summit to keep stretching my skills and interests to figure out how we can find creative ways to engage in architecture and to make architecture more accessible. I think for me, my largest goal is that I want my work to bring love, care, joy, and collectivity kind of back into architectural discourse. And I think kind of bringing the fun and beauty back into architecture, but architecture as a broader community and not just those who have gone through all of the steps to become traditional architects.
Well, Maya, thank you so much for sharing your work with us, and good luck with the second edition of the Design Summit and all your other plans. And thank you all for listening. You can find images of the projects Maya has discussed on our Instagram feed at design.emergency. And we look forward to welcoming you back to Design Emergency soon, when we'll be talking with another global design leader who, like Maya, is forging positive change. Goodbye.